the funny thing about it is he measured the fields for a full day, and I think just before sunrise, it was the highest point where he got unimaginably high readings. He was using it for corn seed growth, and he got huge stalks of corn. What I think he didn't understand is that they were using this energy in another way. If you read Carlos Barrero's book, The Book of Destiny, at one time, and this is a mind blower, he states through the elders that, and this is thousands of years ago, there were 55,000 pyramids from Yucatan to Guatemala actively pumping energy in the atmosphere. We don't know what they were doing with this energy. Today, there's only 5,000 active. The ancients understood these telluric energy fields in ways that we don't understand. They were tuning forks. Their physicality was a tuning fork to understand, to feel the energy and know where the high points were and where the low points were.
Today we have on the show Cliff Dunning from the podcast Earth Ancients, and we are talking about ancient aliens, we are talking about ancient pyramids, we are talking about perhaps ancient, highly advanced technological civilizations, all things that float around the periphery of what's possible, but might not be accepted now.
And what was fascinating is looking through some of the references that Cliff sent us before the show, I was super skeptical of the mechanisms, and I started reading about it, and I'm like, wow, it does seem like electric currents help plants grow, and wow, it does seem like you can get electric currents out of the earth. You know, there are such things that have been patented as different types of earth batteries and so forth. And the further I got into this, the more I was intrigued at the possibilities. So
Cliff is a fantastic resource about ancient cultures.
if you are already supporting us, thank you so much. It's absolutely critical to keeping the show going. If you like what we do, just share the podcast with your friends. And if you really love what we do, consider joining our Patreon. You can come to our weekly chats, help us steer the ship, and figure out what we're going to do next. And it's really eventually leading to a better production for everyone. So consider just supporting the community that way with however little or much you can donate on a regular basis. And we're going to try to move this into more live conversations, more roundtable conversations. We've just gotten a grant for a new camera, and we're going to keep improving the show with the money that you give us. So let's make it happen.
Enjoy the conversation with Cliff Dunning and tell us all about it in the comments. We'll see you next week.
The scientific revolution starts now.
Let us see in the dark.
Yeah, I have a hard time with that, man. I'm like, I get so uptight when I get behind this microphone sometimes. And
Dude, you just got to cut loose. Just like if
right?
Anastasia was going, you know, Michael, you're an ass. That would be a great show. The bickering show.
I don't know. We bicker a lot. I feel like nobody would want to watch that.
I swear to God, it's like you can't be happy all the time. You know, it's like that's not being human. You got to reveal the human condition. You know, I have an upset stomach today. Well, what's your problem? Are you angry about, you know, get into it and then cut into the show.
Yeah, it's funny because we had just had like this psychedelics researcher from Johns Hopkins on the show, and it was such a like sterile conversation because I felt like really scared to even admit to like smoking weed on a microphone or something. I don't know why. I guess because I like grew up in Ohio, and you know these things are like super bad news when I was growing up. You know, only bad people like did drugs and stuff.
Well, for me, like my parents are watching, and I remember when I was a kid, I smoked pot, and my mom caught me, and she cried for days.
Because you'd gone to the dark side.
Yeah, well, I mean, she's like a conservative Soviet immigrant, and she watches what they say about marijuana on the television, and the television says only bad things. And so it was just, for me, I'm like, if I admit to any kind of non-normative behavior and my parents are listening, I just imagine my mom crying.
My mom is definitely my mom's definitely crying right now.
I'd love to see you guys talk about your trip on ayahuasca sometime. You know, how you could go back and forth.
It hasn't happened yet, unfortunately. It's on the bucket list for sure, but I'm actually kind of terrified of it Like I actually had a really intense experience just on edible marijuana last month, and it was like enough to. It took me to another planet for sure. That stuff can. People don't realize how intense marijuana can be. Actually, it's
Well,
sort of
no,
like,
I wrote a book on cannabis sexual ecstasy, and I do not recommend people using edibles. It's just too dangerous. And I don't mean dangerous like you can die. No one's died of cannabis, uh, but you can take a bit of a brownie or have a gummy, and because it's goes through the liver, it can really be intensified to the point where it's psychedelic.
yeah, it can be
And
really
you're
intense.
seeing stuff, it's like, what?
Right. We recently made some oil out of just all of these trim leaves that our friend grew, and you have it in a dropper, so you can really dial back and have just like a tiny bit, essentially. But yeah, before we got the dropper, it was just an accidental like, oh, I'll just have a little spoonful of
You
this.
have a teaspoon of it.
Oh
and,
my
like,
God.
12 hours later, you emerge from the cave having seen.
We happened to be like on this hike down in this canyon at the time too. I was like, oh, I'll just have a little bit of this for this hike,
Oh,
and
man.
it was just, there was no shade and the sun was just beating down on me,
Like
and
2,000
just,
feet of elevation gained to
yeah,
hike out.
It was
Yeah,
don't do drugs, kids.
I'm
kind of
sorry to
thing.
hear that, dude. I'm really sorry to hear that because that's not a great experience. And to have a trip that lasts 5, 6, 7 hours, it's like, when does it end? Especially if on
Yeah.
a hike. So
I think good things come out of like the challenging parts though too. You're kind of like, well, like I got through that, or like you have all these like even the things where you re-examine yourself and you're like, you really think about like the kind of like uglier pieces, or like, oh, do I sound like I sound like an asshole when I say that or whatever. I think it's good for you at the end. You make it through and you're like, all right. I mean, it's not something I'm trying to repeat anytime soon, but
yeah.
yeah.
What were you eating? Oh, you had the eyedropper. You had a spoon of the. Wow. That's
We just made some like olive oil.
Yeah, it's just like a double boiler. I mean, it was shockingly potent because we've made it before and it's always been from flour. And this time our friend brought over literally like a contractor grade trash bag full of trim.
Wow.
And I just ground down a couple blenderfuls of it and just equal amounts of oil and dry material. And it was just, and I wasn't expecting it to be that strong. I'm like, I've made oil before. It's always kind of middling efficacy, and it's leaves.
Yeah.
It's not even really bud.
Must have been a during the harvest, so it was at its full strength, whatever you're using. Yeah.
His ability to grow is really astonishing.
Yeah, some people really have green thumbs when it comes. I'm terrible. I've been growing for 5 or 6 years, and every year I'm like, God, what the hell's the story here? It's not strong enough because I'm up here in Northern California, and it's like some of the and my son is a farmer. He actually grows cannabis, so he'll give me like little bits and pieces. And I'm like, this is so good. What the hell happened to my growth? So.
Yeah, we're trying it for the first time this year. We're allowed 4 plants where we live, and yeah, all 4 of them are they all have their own personality. One of them's like never really got off the ground very high. One of them's the wrong color. It's not an easy thing to pull off.
You got regular sun for all of them, or do you have partial sun?
It's like it's not in the sunniest part of the yard, so the sun comes up like maybe around 10 or something in the summer there. It's shaded a little bit and then goes down over the fence. So
if you can give them like direct sun all day, there'll be monsters. I learned that a couple of years ago because I tried growing 5 or 6 hours a day. It's not going to be the full extent of the possibility of the growth. So my experience, at least. So
I'm really excited for the CBD plant, actually, which is like the unsung hero of all of this. I could never afford to buy this stuff. You see these CBD oil jars like at the health food stores. They're like $50-$60. But the CBD is really amazing. And a lot of people don't realize this, but if you use CBD after THC, it will like abrogate the effects of the THC. Yeah. It's amazing.
Or if you're having a bad trip, you can do a dropper full of CBD.
Totally. Yeah. It's amazing.
I keep it here. Even if I have a bad interview, I'll take a shot of this.
Yeah, so I'm really excited for that plant. I think more than anything else, I mean, the regular weed, we live like in the Emerald Triangle, so regular weed is just everywhere. But yeah, it's very hard to get that CBD stuff.
Yeah, did it
It
come
is.
up in your research of the cannabis and sexuality, or is it like totally THC centered?
No, I have a doctor who I co host with the show sometimes, and she recommended CBD. And then I discovered through my interviews that physical activity, you get up and start breathing, if you're having a bad trip and you're scared or whatever, exercise will just drop it to nothing. And then the other thing is eating something
Hmm.
that'll immediately shut down any kind of bad trip. And we're talking about cannabis now. If you're on ayahuasca, DMT, peyote, you're gonna ride
Forget
with it.
about it.
You're gonna ride it whether you like it or not. So
So what is the book about? You said that you just put out a book on cannabis
yeah, I
and
just
sexuality,
published
right?
a book, Cannabis and Sexuality, Cannabis and Sexual Ecstasy for Men, uh, published by Simon and Schuster. It was came through. In 2018, I was the uh, program director for the Cannabis Summit in San Francisco, and I was asked to do it because I had an interest in it, and I knew the producer. What I discovered in my research is that there's a long history of using cannabis, uh, not just for health benefits, but for sexuality. And the Hindus who were using cannabis, as well as the Chinese, this is 3 to 4 thousand years ago, were doing it in a form of patronage to Lord Shiva, the god Shiva. And what little did I know, and I do yoga, not only is Shiva the god of yoga, but he's also the god of sexuality and of cannabis. And there's temples in India that are filled with these various tantric sexual partnering, and there's some animal work too. But the plant, the cannabis plant, full flowers are everywhere. And so I was always like, what is that all about? So anyhow, I started looking into it and discovered that not only is there a long history of the benefits of it, but like I just said, the aspects of sexuality are huge. And what the Hindus did before these tantric orgies was to create a drink called Bang, Bhang. And you've probably heard of that. And they basically crushed very, very full bloom leaves, added some milk, and added some sugar and crushed it and made it into a kind of a mush. Actually, they still do it today during a lot of their ceremonies. And they would drink this and start coupling as a tantric ritual. Well, it wouldn't go for a few minutes. These people were having orgasms for hours. And this is the whole trip of the book. The book's about male sexuality and women's sexuality. But what I discovered is when you use the specific types of cannabis that have high levels of terpenes, specifically limonene, you can have, as a man, you can have multiple orgasms because it's directed to the prostate, which is really the master gland for men. It's not the penis, it's the prostate. I don't know if this is not, you should put a 18 and above
Explicit.
rating on your show today.
Hey man, as long as you don't mention the pandemic or something, we should be fine. YouTube doesn't care about
No,
anything
I thought you were
else.
going to say something like get political.
Yeah, well, as long as you're political in one of the two camps that are allowed, you're totally good to go.
I don't know. I can't get political on my show. I get hammered big time. Anyhow, the book gets into male sexuality, tantric positions, and I have 2 chapters on what I call what is known as the arousal strains. And these are strains that are designed not only to arouse, but once you engage in a sexual activity, it actually tricks exponential release of hormones and triggers quicker orgasms, stronger orgasms, and for men and women, multiple orgasms. And the end of my book gets into why the ancients were focused on orgasm. We don't talk a lot about that right now because we're kind of a pent up society that doesn't discuss sexuality without, parental perfume,
Yeah, like a little warning label. Well, I mean,
Although,
I've
yeah.
heard it discussed in terms of the orgasm gap, but that's pretty much it.
Yeah. So what I've discovered and what more researchers are uncovering is that there are levels of orgasm. There's the simple orgasms like, great. And then there's those that transcend the body. And this is where the multiple orgasms have been studied in women for years, but men haven't had a multiple orgasm because they can't. And when you focus on the prostate gland, you don't have to have an orgasm with seminal ejection. You don't have to have, the coming part. You can just repeat it by stimulating the prostate constantly. And this is where light massage in the abdomen for men with specific types of cannabis can really trigger these powerful multiple orgasms that lead to levels of orgasm that are transcending the physical. So
What are the
happened?
strains?
Yeah.
What are the strains? Are they like just like are they
I'll give you a
indos? Are they
secret.
sativa? I only know about
to-
indica and sativa, so that's why I
I launched a website for the book called themaleorgasm.com, and I give away chapter 4, which has all the arousal strains. So some of the classics are Sour Diesel, Blue Dream,
which are sativas, right?
yeah,
What I
Granddaddy Purple, but they're also mostly most of the good ones are hybrids, simply because they can dial in the terpene
I see.
limonene.
Yeah, what most people don't understand is that cannabis has hundreds of different compounds, but for some reason, like because of the federal regulation or something, THC is the only one that gets talked about. Maybe CBDs, but there's like hundreds of these different compounds.
I think THC
Yeah.
is the only one that obliterates, and I think that people like to take substances because the substances erase them for a moment. And
I
so it's-
agree. Yeah.
It's like the closest one to alcohol or something.
Yeah,
Like,
I think so. I
it's
mean,
like
I
what's familiar.
I mean,
It's intoxicating.
yeah, exactly. Like you.
I
Take a
don't know
hit-
why the United States isn't completely legalized, because it's now, I think it's 2/3 of the country is legal, and it's growing. In November, there's supposed to be 16 other states that are voting for legalization, recreational use and medical use. But why the country is not completely legal is really a curiosity. And I think it's because what you're saying, people are either not in the know, they're afraid of it, and there's also a lot of wrong data on the effects. And there's always this fear that if you start using as a young person cannabis, you're going to get into heroin and
exactly. Like we've all
There's a
been to
word
the DARE
for it.
program.
Which
Yeah.
is weird because like seemingly the only way that would even happen is if you were dealing with the same people to get your weed that were selling heroin. You know, it's like by making it illegal, you've actually made that a possibility all of a sudden.
Yeah, you've basically put the pipeline. You've combined the two pipelines in terms of distribution. That's interesting.
The sad thing about it, though, is when we made it illegal, the whole world did too. So all this data and research that was going on in the 70s was shut down, and now we're looking at it from a research point of view and finding it's a miracle drug. It's great for neurological disorders, people that have MS, that have certain types of cancer. You don't have to take these toxic drugs. You can use certain types of cannabis to really aid healing. And we're just at the very tip of the iceberg on this, because there's so many compounds that we haven't identified in this plant. And I think that we're going to see some radical discoveries in this plant, which is in very many ways similar to our cellular structure. It's really weird.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, there's the cannabinoids and there's endocannabinoids that are almost identical. And so when you take in cannabis, there's a linking of these two cellular levels into one. And this is where not only you have powerful healing, but you have powerful sexual experiences. You can have, like I said, you can have what I call transcendent orgasms that lead what the ancients called to nirvana. And there's writings of people using bang and having these transitions where they're talking to beings on different levels. And I'm like, whoa, what product was that? Well, that's a couple thousand years ago. So
It's interesting. I have a friend who does body work, like myofascial manipulation. And this guy's like completely convinced that all health problems essentially can be traced back to, you know, organs being held in the wrong place, like basically tissue calcification and, connective tissue being locked up. And he insists that the cannabis will actually teach someone about, where their different tension spots are that need to be released. And I think there is something to the idea that the cannabis makes you more aware of your body. And so I can
Yeah.
see the sexual elements of it playing in, just in terms of like my greatest experiences with music. And I think it's very similar. Like, I think it does make you more aware of the sounds that you're hearing in a way. Like, you can hear things that are more subtle. You're more what's the word, more attentive, like more you're more sensitive, really, I guess is what it comes down to. It's like weed is a very strong sensitizer of any other experience. It makes you very aware of all the little details of things, which might be annoying under general operating conditions of everyday life, but it can be quite powerful if you have something in mind, like I'm going to focus all of this attention on sex, or I'm going to focus it all on my body work or on my
Yeah.
music, or so if you have some intention associated with it, that you need all of that extra stimulant information, whatever it is, stimulatory.
I actually, probably like 2 years ago at this point, I wrote an article because I was curious about the endocannabinoid system and the effects of CBDs. And and nobody really knows why we have the endocannabinoid system. The receptors are spread throughout the body.
Yeah.
Like
They're
in
in
the
the eyes, the
guts.
brain, the guts, the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system. And it seems like it's a substance that, like you said, affects everything. And I was sitting around and I was like, okay, but so when you consume cannabinoids, they change your perception of the world and what you see. And so what if the endocannabinoid system is the system that allows you to create narratives and stories about the world?
That's a great thought. That's a great thought. I have, in the last couple of years, come to the conclusion that cannabis was almost made or delivered to humankind as kind of a beneficial plant medicine, and we don't understand it well enough. But what you're saying is so true. In the little bit of work that I have done, and I'm not a scientist by any means, but I have come to understand that the healing properties are almost intentionally driven. And you brought this up a little while ago. When you introduce intention, I intend for this to work here, I intend for this to work there. There is a support system of the brain setting up the software for the plant medicine to come in and then delivering it. And it's weird to say, but this is how I've found it works for arousal situations. If you use intention prior to the inhalation or use of cannabis, not only will it be magnified, but it'll have greater direction and greater ability to deliver not only healing but amazing trips.
Well, that's the funny thing, is the opposite of that I think is true for bad trips too, where like your attention is dissociated and you're paying attention to all these things all at once and they're freaking you
Yeah.
out, and like your thoughts are like coming in sideways and you just thought of something that happened when you were a child and it's like, where did that come from? And I think that's essentially behind like that inability to have that intentional experience might be, and the chaos that results from not having that intention could be part of the bad trip itself.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because prior to the last 4 years, I never thought about using intention. In fact, the use of intention seems to be kind of a new pitch for living a better life right now. It's fascinating how I intend for this to happen. I do tours every year in Egypt, and I tell everybody, in fact, we sit down and meditate prior to going to any major temples, and I say, okay, if you want this to happen, your intention must be clear, direct, and supportive of what you want to do. And without a doubt, everybody who uses their intention comes back and says, wow, that was an amazing sight. Because there's things we don't know. There's things we can't see or feel. And the ancients knew all about this stuff, about the sensory reaction, about what the body's doing when they walk into a temple. Because a lot of these temples are turned on. They're sitting over ley lines, energetic fields.
Yeah, I wanted to say we had a chance to read a bit of the book that you had mentioned when we talked earlier. Do you remember the name of it?
Seeds of Knowledge, Stones of Plenty?
Yeah, I
Oh,
wanted to
John
talk to you
Burke.
about that.
John
Yeah.
Burke's the man.
Speaking
He
of
died
like
so
telluric
suddenly.
currents and
I mean,
Yeah,
he
what
died.
happened?
He had a massive coronary or something. Not very old. I think he was in his late 50s.
mm,
And the one book is like I reference it so much right now. But his work was being extended into um, temples, various temples when he passed away.
Hmm.
So
can you summarize it really quickly? Like just
To like orient people?
yeah, just to orient people who are listening for the
so
first.
John Burke was a scientist, but also a businessman who was curious about how ancient people cultivated seeds, and he had a business in selling different types of crop seeds,
Hmm.
corn, rice, and so on. And so, as a scientist, and I think he was a natural scientist. I don't think he was a physicist. Anyhow, so he collected and used the latest electronic measurement scanning technology when he went out to these sites. And what he discovered was that the ancients built their monuments, mounds, temples, and in many cases pyramids over energy points, what we call today ley lines. The term that scientists use a lot of times is telluric energy fields. These are naturally occurring points where energy rises up. These are electromagnetic or gravitational energy fields that come up from the ground. And what the ancients apparently were able to do, just sensing the energy, was to capture it in mounds, to capture it in sculpture reliefs, and in Mexico, to capture it in pyramids.
I
You
gotta
don't,
say real quick, I just gotta interject. Like when I first heard about this, I was like, I kind of like groaned a little bit, like, oh no, because anytime people outside of science use the word energy, and usually when people in science use the word energy, it's this nebulous concept. No one knows what they're talking about. But I looked into this a little bit, and there really have been patented inventions for ground batteries, and the idea these currents in the earth are quite measurable, and
yeah,
these magnetic anomalies too, where you have field line excursions at these sites, seem to be reproducible too. So, and the fact that plants do seem to prefer these strong electric fields, well, middling electric fields, which will lead to better growth. These have all checked out, and there's actually universities studying all these things. So, I stand. It sounded kind of like a crazy idea to me at first, and then the deeper I looked into it, I was like, wow, this is legit.
yeah. Burke was probably about 7 to 10 years ahead of himself, and this is why what he did is still not well understood. But what makes his work brilliant and why I appreciate it is that he went to major sites like the Giza Plateau for the Great Pyramid, measured energy there, Tikal, which is filled with pyramids in Guatemala, uh, places that I'm familiar with, which is the Yucatan, Mexico, that's the Great Pyramids there. And he picked up different types of energy fluctuation during the day. His biggest discovery was at a place in Tikal called the World Pyramid.
The last
And
pyramid, I think. I was just reading it this morning.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, what was it called?
I think it's the last pyramid.
Lost World Pyramid. Yeah. The funny thing about it is he measured the fields for a full day, and I think just before sunrise, it was the highest point where he got unimaginably high readings. He was using it for corn seed growth, and he got huge, huge stalks of corn. What I think he didn't understand is that they were using this energy in another way. If you read Carlos Barrero's book, The Book of Destiny, at one time, and this is a mind blower, he states through the elders that, and this is thousands of years ago, there were 55,000 pyramids from Yucatan to Guatemala actively pumping energy in the atmosphere. We don't know what they were doing with this energy. Uh, Today, there's only 5,000 active. Unfortunately, Barreros died in the COVID plague, as well as a number of other friends of mine, elders and Native Americans, that just devastated the Native population. But uh, getting back to Burke, he has been able to track and show that the ancients understood these telluric energy fields in ways that we don't understand. They were tuning forks. Their physicality was a tuning fork to understand, to feel the energy and know where the high points were and where the low points were.
Something that was really interesting to me about what they wrote about in Seeds of Knowledge was that they went to multiple pyramids in Tikal, and there was only one of the pyramids that had this astonishing effect. And
Right.
they proposed that it had to do with the age of the pyramids, where the Lost World Pyramid was the oldest one,
The
and
oldest.
the newer ones were built in emulation of the old one without any of the underlying knowledge of what actually made it a significant structure.
Like the people who practiced the electrical harnessing were a previous civilization, and maybe I don't know what they're called, Tikalis, the early Mayans, right? Tikal is supposed to be one of the earliest Mayan cities.
I call them pre-Maya, or the first ones.
Right on. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the pre-Mayans, they were the ones who had the idea for it, I guess. And then the Mayans came along and were like, "Oh, that's a cool looking pyramid. Let's build some of those too."
Yeah.
And so it might not be any surprise that we don't have the original architecture even of these structures that were best able to harness these energy flows.
I think there's also two earlier pyramids within that final pyramid that they tested. And we don't know the age, but conventional archaeologists tend to think that they're 3,000 years old. It's because they're using dating. It's crazy what they use. They'll use some organic material around the base of a pyramid, and that'll be the date that they'll come up with without thinking of looking at the interior of this place where this.
Well, you can't tell the age of a rock, right? I mean, you can tell the age of a rock for when it was formed, maybe. Using radiometric, but you can't actually tell when it was harnessed for a structure. It's just it's next to impossible.
You might be able to use some kind of lichen growth. Like there was a really interesting paper. So I used to give tours in the Columbia Gorge, and so tell the story of the Missoula floods and everything that happened.
That's a cool story.
It's a really, really cool story, and we live in an area in Southern Oregon where it seems like there's also a similar story to be told like that, but nobody's told it yet. Because we wander around and I'm like, this is a floodplain, and you look into the history and everybody's just like,
There's like sand on the hilltops and stuff. It's very strange.
Yeah, but there's a mountain in the gorge, I think it's called Dog Mountain or something like that, where the entire face of it came down during a huge earthquake, right? One of the Cascadia subduction events. And for a long time, people were trying to figure out when it happened. And so they were looking at all of these old texts, and they were trying to reconstruct it from that. And then they were trying to reconstruct it from, the radiocarbon dating of trees that had died. And this one guy came along, and he basically proposed using lichens. He was like, lichens have a specific rate of growth, and that rate of growth can be used to extrapolate how new the rock face is. And so he went through and he cataloged all of the size of the lichens on the new rocks versus the old rocks, and he came up with a date that ended up being 10 years away from what they ended up finding in the records of Japan.
Oh, that's very cool.
But if it's like 100,000 years old, like it's just gonna be a pile of dust in the center.
That's true.
That's more like what? Yeah, we've had a couple times on the show now. I don't think we've released the second one, but Mario Bildrups, who has this really interesting theory of the orientation of ancient structures with respect to a shifting North Pole, and he brought to our attention one of my favorite new facts, which is just that we're often taught in school that, first was the Stone Age, which was maybe, a few tens of thousands of years ago. Then was the Bronze Age, and then was the Iron Age. And now we have the internet. And, that's a cool story. That's a cool story. That's a cool story. But Mario pointed out, and I just love this, because I put it in front of NASA people. I put it in front of a lot of people, right? And it's a really good point. He's like, hey, actually, if you look at how long iron survives, it's about as long as from now to the Iron Age. And if you look at how long bronze survives, it's about from now to the bronze and the stone as well, right? So, of course, any place you look, let's assume just for fun that there was an ancient civilization 100,000 years ago. Well, the only thing that's going to be left is going to be stone. So of
Yeah.
course, like big mounds of dust, are maybe this. Even if you go and look at Manhattan, what's it going to be if we just walk away for 100,000 years? It's going to be
Yeah.
mounds of dust, right? There's not going to be any iron. There's not going to be any plastic. There's not going to
Yeah.
be any bronze, right? It's going to be a Stone Age mound.
You have to wonder if the ancients who built these megalithic temples that are granite knew that, because granite's not going to disintegrate after thousands of years. It's rock, hard rock. But I mean, these guys built with such elegance. It's like, what do they know that we don't know? But they know a lot. That's the bottom line. So
There's something to be said about the ability to harness huge armies of slave labor to produce buildings like that, right? Like granite is a labor-intensive building material that requires you to have a lot of people that you can basically whip into working on it.
yeah, but you have to understand, you're talking about the dynastics, and that's credit. Those they wrote about using slaves. There's a pre-dynastic period where the biggest blocks apparently were cut, and some of the largest statuary was carved. And I've spoken and had engineers, one guy specifically who's a NASA engineer, say outright and write about the fact that he believes that the largest Ramsey II sculptures were machined.
Mm.
And he actually detects where the machine starts and stops on the face, on the arms, on the legs. And when you see it on a microscopic level, he's dead on. There's no way it was cut by a chisel or a laser. It was some kind of a high rotating cutting device, some
Like
kind
a
of a blade.
CNC mill or something.
There's also a bunch of anthropologists who are catching on to the idea that a lot of these, there was a lot of anomalous ancient cultures, including Teotihuacan, that didn't seem to have the stratification where there was like a slave class and like a ruling class. It actually was a city that sort of looked like a bunch of luxury apartments. There wasn't a palace, there wasn't a slave quarters, but somehow they have enormous pyramids, right? Some of the biggest ones in our hemisphere.
Yeah.
It's like,
have you seen Teotihuacan? Did you go?
yeah, I've been there twice. It's pretty amazing.
I mean, you look at the Sun Pyramid, you're like, how in the heck did they build that?
Right?
Because
or did
huge.
they, how many times did they build it? Like how many different civilizations were there even? I mean, those are impossible questions to answer if you're looking for pieces of cloth, pieces of carbon, even carbon things. If you're looking for metal tools, even, nothing's going to survive for more than a few thousand years.
Yeah.
Other than that big pile of rubble that maybe somebody built another pyramid on top of.
Well, because they rebuilt Teotihuacan pretty extensively, right? Like, because the pictures of them finding it in I think it was the 1920s when they first stumbled on it, it looks in pretty bad condition. But when you go today, the angles are all clean and everything is put back together. And so do you know the extent to which they rebuilt it?
They took off about 4 or 5 feet of topsoil from top to bottom, which took them years to do. They had to bring a train in there. They would put the dirt and get rid of it, move it on. I think, and I've been there a few times, I think it's been continually occupied for thousands of years and modified. Last October, I had a chance to meet with Dr. Sergio Gomez, who is the one of the directors of the Quetzalcoatl Pyramid. And we went underneath the pyramid.
Yeah, I saw his article recently about the tunnels. Yeah,
we actually went and did what he showed in National Geographic. We went to see this tunnel. It was one of the lifetime kinds of visits. But one of the things he brought up, which was amazing, was that in this tunnel was huge volumes of mercury. Number one. Number two, there was a strange smelling, exotic perfume like gas that kept coming through. And at the very end where the tunnel terminates, there's a two smaller side tunnels that kind of make a T. There was an electromagnetic anomaly that would shut their cameras off, shut their walkie-talkies off, shut all lights off for long periods of time. I mean, their batteries on their walkie-talkies were drained within a few minutes.
Whoa.
And the thing that, and this is a wonderful guy. Gomez is a good person, but he didn't seem to care about the chemical release that had a perfume smell, and this strange anomaly of electricity being sucked out wasn't a concern of his either. And I asked him, well, did you have a chemist come down and check this out? No. Did you use any kind of device to measure the electromagnetic fields down there? No. So
There's work to be done.
Yeah.
Let's get down there.
the problem is that they're closing up the pyramid or the tunnel in about, let's see, what's today? This is August, in a couple of months, and it's
Why is
not
that?
for anyone because they're done doing the research. If you remember, his discovery of this tunnel led to a whole bunch of funeral artifacts and sculptures. That's the big goal of archaeologists, is to find the tomb, is to find the gold. It's almost like they're conquistadors. Where's the gold? Forget the codices with the knowledge of the Maya. Where's the gold? Where's the rubies and the So I thought to myself, why did they not bring in other scientists to analyze this amazing tunnel? And I mean, I'm writing about this in a book called The Maya Controversy because when we look at the historical record of these Mesoamerican people, it's academically driven. There's no asking, there's no questions, there's no referencing the living natives. Now, I'm a Mayanist. I've been down there. I had an elder with me for 10 years. Humboldt's Men was his name. He told me a completely different story of their people. He told me the sciences were very unique. They were natural-based sciences. Do you know, of all the books that were written, and we've been studying Maya for about 150 years, there's not one reference or one interview or one look at the Mayan people from living descendants. From living descendants. No.
That's hard to imagine.
And this is the devastation we have as a history. We have an askewed history that is based on Western thought. And this is the problem when we start talking about telluric energy. Because we don't have that reference, it's all fantasy, it's all woo-woo. What do you mean telluric fields? There's no such thing as telluric fields. Well, there is, because of guys like John Burke, and this is what makes Burke so amazing. But getting back to my point about the archeological community, and this goes for Egyptologists too, they're living and they're chronicling new discoveries based on 150-year-old theory and also science.
That tends to be the case because there's a style, right? So I had a really weird experience. I went to a concert the other day, and it was this concert in the park, and it was a metal band. And there were 3 metal kids, teenagers, the exact same metal kids that were in my high school, 20 years ago almost. I recognized them immediately. I was like, those are the kids, and they were very much into the music, and they stood like idols at the front and basically did the headbanging. And then there was another kid who came through and was not dressed like them and didn't look like them. He didn't have long hair. He didn't have the right outfit, and he tried to interact with them, and they basically shoved him away. And I watched this happen multiple times, right? Of this kid, of him attempting to breach the ramparts of this unified group that had identified themselves as metalheads, and they were like, "You don't fit. You don't look like us."
Yeah.
And so they were able to spurn him. And I think the same thing is happening inside of academia, where there are people who basically have a title of archaeologist or geologist or biologist, and there's an archetype of what that looks like, and that archetype does not involve itself in the story of the indigenous peoples or anything that's beyond the realm of what is interesting to academia.
Yeah, I think it's a horrible loss of knowledge. And Carlos Barrero said something to me just before he died that was exciting but sad because he couldn't follow it up. He said that in a small village in Guatemala, there is another book of knowledge. It's another um, native book on the past that's been kept for thousands of years by this one tribe, and they wanted to release it. It's called a codis. We see them sometimes in their bark. One of my native elder friends told me that most of the codices, and this is another mind blower, are transcribed from technical manuals.
Hmm.
There were technical manuals of how to run the observatory, the energy, and all this other stuff that was handed down for thousands of years. But because Carlos passed away, there's no way to find who this tribe is because they're very secretive. They're not going to come out and say, "Hey, we're here. We got a new codis, and it speaks about this and that." No, because the Maya have been fighting with the Mexican government for decades, right up to the 60s. They're not forthwith in any of this information. But these are the kind of things that are being lost to us because of the scientific method and their inability and basically racist views of the living Maya. And it's just every time I think about it, and this is why I totally inspired to write this book called The Maya Controversy, because the ancients that Michael was speaking of, the pre-Maya, those were the minds behind the classic Maya. All their data was handed down.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I might have mentioned when we spoke a few weeks ago that Dr. Richard Hansen, who's excavating El Mirador in Guatemala, his work is excavating the largest known pyramids in the Americas. And what he discovered is that site and the 60,000 plus additional sites that LIDAR technology found a few years ago represents pre-Maya culture.
And these ones are essentially just stuck in the mud still, right? They're just basically tree-covered hills at this point.
They calculated it's going to take 200 years to properly survey, excavate, and really find out what's there. But I've seen some of these images, and it's some of the most beautiful sculptural pyramids I've ever seen. Multiple angles, multiple geometric shapes, stuff that we don't see today. So it really is and I have to wonder, do the archaeologists, are they avoiding it because it's going to open a Pandora's box, or they just don't have the financing to go in there and do it? I mean, 60,000 buildings is not a few, it's a lot. But my point is that we haven't dissected the language of the pre-Maya. We don't understand their culture. What looks to have happened is that there was a horrific event that wiped them out. This could be the biblical flood. This could be sunspots. It could be whatever. And then the
social polarization.
Well, I keep thinking of Mario. You know, if the planet was shifting and the crustal displacement happened to a certain level, we do know that northern Mexico had huge tsunamis that came as far as 20 miles inland. Can you imagine how tall a tsunami must have been?
I mean, man, the ocean floor is only 200 million years old, which is crazy. Like some wild stuff's happened in a pretty short amount of time geologically, for sure.
I mean, I sent you an article that I wrote for Ancient Origins magazine, and one of the figures is of a I call him robot head because the head is very, very strange.
Yeah, that one's crazy. Actually,
if you look at the body, Michael, that body has been eroded through seawater and great pressure.
Interesting.
So I think that whole Yucatan area was probably under a couple 100 feet of water at one point for a long period of time.
Nothing would surprise me at this point. The more that I look into the deep past, the more I'm convinced we know very little about it. It's this one thing that really troubles me is that we know that North America, especially the northern latitudes, New York and around the Great Lakes, were covered with a glacier fairly recently. And nothing survives getting covered with a glacier. No pyramids survive that.
No laptops, no iPhones, no plastic.
And I don't think that it's a mistake that New York City is where it is. I think that if you were going to build a big civil, a big metropolitan area, you'd probably do it somewhat. It could happen up there. Toronto's up there, New York's up there. They could have been full-on metropoli that are just powder now, and we'd never know about it. And so who knows what could have happened other than glaciers down south as well.
Well, I think that down south, you have a lot of volcanic activity, you have a lot of tectonic activity, you have a lot of
I feel like 8.0 earthquakes are not rare down in Mexico City.
Especially
no, they're up there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then you also have the jungle that grows wildly, right?
It swallows everything.
I mean, it just swallows everything. The rate of topsoil formation in the tropics is beyond what we can fathom. If you're thinking about, something that was built 10,000 years ago and it's already covered by, feet and feet of topsoil.
I think they think El Mirador is not even that old, right? So I think they think it's probably only a couple of thousand years old would be my guess.
You're like El Mirador is like 3?
I mean, what is the archaeological momentary consensus about the age? It's probably pretty conservative.
Let's see.
Of what?
2,000 years.
When do they think that El Mirador was built?
Oh, El Mirador is 3,000 years. I mean, Hansen's just pushed it back. Here's some interesting things, though. He believes that the residents of El Mirador fought with the Olmec. They're older than the Olmec, and he now believes that these pre-Maya were contemporaries of the Olmec, and that the Olmec weren't the mother culture that scientists believe they were. And he's done carbon dating on a lot of posts and buildings, and they're actually contemporary
with the Olmecs.
With the Olmec, yeah, which is not out in any books. Unfortunately, these discoveries take a decade to get in the history books, so it's like, oh yeah, the Olmec are the ones. So.
Yeah, but I mean, if you think about how buried El Mirador was over 3,000 years, and you think about something that's, let's say, something that's 50,000 years old, something that's 100,000 years old, there's no
just forget
way.
About it, right? It's going to look like a hill, and you're not going to really be able to differentiate anything else besides a hill.
I would say that's a good assessment for certain buildings, but if you ever go to Egypt, and you see, you go to Dendera and you see the Hathor temple, that's been continuously occupied for thousands of years, and the floor is red granite, and the slabs are roughly 30 tons each. They don't know how they were cut, but what they do know is it sits on an older temple. If Hathor was built 5,000 years ago, they haven't even looked at the temple that it sits on top of. That could be 10, 20,000 years.
And that one could be on a different, it's like, how deep is it? Turtles all the way down? Is it just temple on top of temple on top of temple? Because we talked to Michael Cremo, and Cremo's like, no, humans are 55 million years old in their current form.
Oh, Cremo, forget it. Cremo's like, we're millions and millions and millions. I have him on my show. I'm like, dude, stop. You're my head. I'm losing my brain. No, I mean, and this is another thing that is fascinating. And I don't know if it's cultural, if it's infighting, if it's, I don't know, problems with the archaeological community, but they will not allow ground penetrating radar at many of these Egyptian sites.
Is that because out of respect for what indigenous peoples would prefer, or it's just
I wish it was that easy. No, it's more that there is a great deal of corruption. I think there is a religious fundamentalism that is also an issue. I think also that there isn't a great deal of education when it comes to this. And there's money issues too. But the number of times I've been to Hawthorne and waited for something to open up, and it's always been hinted that this is going to open, this is going to open. It takes decades for any basic cleaning to happen. It takes decades for approval I mean, it's just a nightmare of red tape. And when I was there in earlier this year in May, when I was at the Hathor Temple, they had opened up a small underground chamber that was used as some kind of a meditative center that had beautiful new hieroglyphs and figures. But right next to it was an opening that they had dug down a little too far, and the tops of columns, pyramid columns, were there, meaning that there's a whole other temple below there. Probably goes down another 50 to 60 feet. And we can't see it because of whatever red tape. I mean, I think they have such a bevy of data there of items ready to be open and researched that it's almost too much for them.
Have you talked to anybody who's done like the water erosion research on the fringe about, the Sphinx and
Yeah,
that
I've
kind
had
of thing?
Dr. Robert Schock on many times.
Yeah, that's the guy I was thinking of.
He won't respond to our emails, so next time you talk to him, can you tell him to...
Oh,
you
just
tell him
talk to me. Just send me an email and I'll introduce you. They're really good people. They do smoke weed, but it's okay.
Despite that, yeah.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
he's very cool. He's just really busy. He's at Boston U.
Yeah, I believe it.
He'll
But
love
it's-
your show. No.
Let's
So-
hope so. I mean, but it is fascinating to me that those sort of that narratives that challenge, whole dynasties of information are really hard to squeak in to these discussions.
Yeah.
It's really, really disconcerting, and we see this in astrophysics and cosmology all the time on our show. It's like the idea of dethroning one idea in science is no big deal, but if you're going to dethrone like whole dynasties of careers with your new theory, it's like take that stuff somewhere else. People are just not having it whatsoever.
You have to get a couple of generations away from a beloved figure that has proposed a theory, I think.
Yeah, I brought
Because-
that up last time we talked, is Michael Cole, the father of Mayan history and research. Here's somebody who set the bar for understanding how to excavate a site, what to look for, some of the pluses and minuses of kingships and things like that, as a tenured professor. And then he retires, and the question goes, are these Cambodian Khmer pyramids similar to Mayan? And he's like, well, I couldn't say this as a tenured professor, but yes, there's some very interesting similarities. In fact, I think there could have been a blueprint of how to build a pyramid. What?
Right? And
Yeah, you want to keep that tenure, buddy?
Yeah, we run
Well, he
into
was
this all
gone.
the
He
time.
retired.
Right. No, I know. It's just so fascinating that, there's so
He
much
couldn't say it
self-censoring.
during
Yeah.
tenure.
I mean, you can, right? But it's like, do you want to get that grant? Do you want to have that invited keynote speaker address at the next, it's like,
Do you want people to start treating you like you're the crazy uncle who drools on himself at the table?
And it's really bad with the scientific community because you guys are really hard on each other if you go against the grain,
Oh, yeah.
And the big thing is it's lifestyles. People who are tenured, teachers, professors, whatever, if they start speaking out on thoughts and theories that are they wish to overturn or wish to question, they're hammered.
Oh, yeah.
They're
I mean,
completely
we run
hammered.
into this all the time, even with each other, right? We came up through the scientific system so deeply that one of us will be like, hey, I think that they're wrong about how this is happening. And actually, I think that this is how it's happening. And we literally have to work through the initial response of, what? No, you're wrong. It can't be like that. And then to gradually come around to the idea that, well, maybe it could be. And the only reason that you think that it can't be is because you've just settled into this idea that you like a lot.
Exactly. It's funny that you mentioned the growing community of people who are kind of questioning their education. I interviewed a doctor of neuroscience a couple of days ago. Her name was Mona Subhani at USC. And she wrote a fascinating book called Proof of Spiritual Phenomenon. And her education was in question from the very beginning because she was naturally intuitive about native peoples' theories, past life, reincarnation, which is very much held in honor with the Hindu cultures and some Chinese as well. And her book is a fascinating look at the sciences, how they teach people how to think. And in her case, and her associates, the questions that don't get answered about quantum physics, and you're supposed to just accept these things, which is kind of funny because if you're really a thinking person, you're like, well, wait a minute, can you answer this? No, there's no answer to that. You have to accept it as a physicist.
Yeah, there's no answer and shut up. Like that's how it's taught. It drove me nuts as a child. Like that's honestly why I am where I am today. Is in studying all of these things is I was so dissatisfied, as a kid reading these popular books by these very popular, famous, talking head scientists who are just like, it's crazy, it's magical, and don't worry about it.
Yeah, don't think too hard about it. Don't think. Go to the next subject. Get your.
Like, I don't think so. Absolutely not. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm going to find out. So.
Well,
I love that. That's totally what we're looking for. The next generation going, you know what? This theory, this law, this hypothesis does not work for me. I'm moving on, and we're working on. I'm going to create a foundation, and we're going to look at this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, we've just kind of launched a new YouTube channel too, where we're trying to make material explanations for various quantum spooky things, where we actually just puzzle over how could we just explain this with regular material objects as opposed to magical fields and forces and stuff. Like, what if
there's something that's causing the force? What if there's something?
What if there's a physical cause for this?
Yeah, no, I love that. It gets into a whole discussion about psychic awareness, intuition. How does intuition work? Well, I mean, if you look at some of the great discoveries, intuition is part of it. People having dreams, coming up with formulas. It's like, whoa. Now, how does that part of the brain work into the normal thinking brain? I mean, there's so much that we need to understand.
Psychology is like it's like a bag of worms I can hardly touch. I mean, if you think the atom is complicated, try to understand the human mind. It's like, forget
it's a big
about
one.
it.
Well, the human mind and consciousness and awareness and the universe, right? Because that's basically the question that we're asking at this point, which is, what does it mean to be alive and to experience something that is anomalous? And science is basically like, unless you can produce it in controlled conditions inside of a laboratory, it's not a thing.
Exactly. The scientific method doesn't really work when it comes to the occult, doesn't work with past lives because you can't reproduce it, And so there has to be an evolution to these ways to quantify, qualify different topics. I have to say this, though. Sabatini, who was my interview, has now gone from she calls herself a spiritual scientist now because she's using these unusual theories and sciences that the ancients used, and she's kind of focusing on how they work and how she can apply it to today, which is kind of cool. And she's a researcher. She's a researcher. Yeah, here's her book.
Cool.
Excellent.
Very cool. Yeah, we'll reach out.
Yeah, love that you have that.
No, she'd love you guys.
I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that this thing that's called the scientific method, it's great, but it's actually not really a scientific method. It's actually an engineering method. It works fantastically for building airplanes and building, commerce and commercializing technologies, but it's not very good for actually understanding something in the deep past that's happened that you're trying to reconstruct. It doesn't have an emphasis on mechanics and mechanism and what actually is causing this to have occurred and the exploration of possibilities, right? It's all based on, can we make this thing work? Can we parameterize it in a way that is reproducible, aka predictive, so we can build something, right? It's not really fine-tuned to understanding the past.
Yeah, I would say that it's actually not really even meant for... I would go so far as to say that applying the scientific method to things that are in the past leads to insanity and absolutely nonsensical outcomes, because the power of the scientific method is in controlled variable experimentation. That's what makes it a method, is the fact that you can put it in a jar and you can make sure that it's in a vacuum and you can change one thing, and then you're like, well, when I change this one thing, I get this other thing out, and that means that there's a relationship. But when you're looking at something geological, when you're looking at something astronomical,
I think this is why cosmology is like up on the ropes right now. It's just
It really is.
it really is, and they're trying to squirm out of it, and it's really, really funny. There's all this new James Webb data coming out right now, and yeah.
It's because they say are they finding solar systems in the imaging that's causing questions or what?
There's just things that look like they're older than the Big Bang, right?
Oh,
and the
you.
Big Bang
Yeah.
is the central pillar of astrophysics.
Yeah.
Like if the Big Bang disappears, it's like start over, basically.
Which would be devastating to a lot of people.
And I read this morning an article that was talking about a star that they had found that was 20 billion light years away. And given that the universe is 13.4 billion years old from the Big Bang, you start to have these anomalous dates where people are coming up, inflationary models for how space itself has inflated. And so the reason it's 20 billion light years away is not because we've violated the origin of the universe. It's because, physics has been violated in order to produce the
Yeah, they'll
outputs that we see.
squirm for a long time, for
It's
sure.
it's theory and hypothesis that they've turned into law. It's their
Right.
own fault. They should say this is our theory instead of
Right.
saying this is the way it is, and then be humiliated when there's a new discovery.
Right, and I think that the people who are making these textbooks and so forth need to really change the way that they approach this. Science, this is the terrible thing about confusing science with technology, and the scientific way of prosecuting theories, where you examine all these possibilities and see, which one stands up the best, is very different than building an airplane. Except we teach it because when you build an airplane, you better be damn certain that it's going to fly right before you get on it. So all
Yeah.
of these ideas of proof and certainty make a lot of sense for technology, but when you confuse it with science, you're closing your mind down. You're going to miss a huge field of possibilities if you're convinced that your particular theory is the certain one, and we've done
Yeah.
statistics on it, and like it's done, move on, like stop asking questions. And this couldn't be a worse disservice to actually understanding what's happening far away or in the past, or
But the question to
anything.
you guys is how do you stop the rigidity of the scientific community? How do you say to them, don't stamp this as the one and all. Open and allow flexibility and room for thought. I mean, there are some theories that the scientific community will flat out not debate, and I can't think of them right now, but you know what I'm talking about. It's like, this is locked in cement and stone. This is hallowed ground. You will not talk about it. I mean, I've heard of when I was in college, I had a professor that if you questioned the theory of the United States beyond Columbus, that you were expelled, from the class. I've had people on my show, Earth Ancients, researchers show evidence of Roman coins in the Mississippi, civilizations that were thousands of years older than anything having to do with the United States, and coming up with fairly credible data, and they're considered wacko. Well, why?
So I think that there's two ways to solve this. The first way that you can solve it is you can create a condition where people who have spent a career in science, where they've looked at all of these things and they've understood how weird they are, give them a place where they can come and play with theories. And that's what the project is about, right? That's what the Demystify Sci podcast is. That's the goal, because it gives people who can't publish the stuff in an academic journal, they can come here and they can talk about it, and we don't stamp it with certainty. The ground rules are such that everybody agrees that we're just going to explore possibility, because everybody kind of agrees in the back of their mind with what Shiloh was saying about the problems with treating science as a discipline of certainty. And so you get enough of those people together and you get a critical mass. And the second thing is that I think that you have to let institutions decay and die. And in the shadow of their, slowly dissolving bodies, you build a bunch of new institutions. And it takes a lifetime.
Institutions are built by people too, right?
Yeah.
So kids who are listening to this show, or even college kids who might go on and become professors, we lecture at different universities from time to time, and we have the opportunity to sit in front of 100 kids or young adults and really reframe science for them as something that's a sea of possibilities that you have a duty to narrow down. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's just an opinion from what's known. Like what we
Yeah.
can only make theories, right? And you can pick your favorite, but that doesn't mean that it's true.
And you have to think about it as a really long-term project, this process of building institutions, because you think of some of the world's oldest universities, and they're like 500 years old, 600 years old.
Yeah.
Like
They do change too.
They do change.
change.
But what
right?
I'm trying to say is that the institution that you start today is a seed that you're planting that 500 years ago will be
Yeah.
Oxford or Cambridge.
Yeah,
And you
I
have to
agree.
look at it with that mindset. And if you
Yeah.
look at it with that mindset, I think it's easy to just be like, okay, that's gonna do its thing. It's gonna dissolve. It's gonna decay. We're planting a garden that hopefully will pass along to the next generation. And as long as you focus on the fact of the next generation will keep these ideas, it comes back to this almost indigenous transmission of knowledge,
I
where
like that. Yeah.
where you have to make sure that the knowledge stays alive, and it doesn't matter that it's not in the halls of power. Those will go away.
And
Those
textbooks are
Yeah.
always like 20 years behind what's actually happening. So.
Those-
It's
Get over it.
frustrating though, because here we're sitting here and I'm being the archaeological community on the head and going, what are you doing? What are you doing? And I see the changes and I hear what you're saying. And I think you're right. It's just that here we're alive now. Do I have to wait and come back another time to see the change?
You
Because it's
might.
going to be, fragmented. Luckily, we still read books. We still have the internet. So there's a lot of really good people out there that are talking about the changes. But for me, it's not happening fast enough.
I mean, I think
So-
that's a really common problem, and why people tend to not work on these century problems, because
Yeah.
we all want to see the impact of our work. And if we
Yeah.
commit ourselves to a project that's going to take multiple generations, it's really hard to feel after a lifetime of working on something that you've accomplished something, because you look at
Yeah.
it and you're like, well, the goal is still who knows how far away it is. And it's very difficult to be satisfied with the fact that you've moved it down the line. And what you said something interesting where you're like, I beat the archaeology community on the head. And I think that that's it's so easy to want to be, to want to do that. To be frustrated with the people that have their hands on the reins and are leading us in crazy directions and getting up on talk shows and talking about lunatic things where they're like, you're not meant to understand it. Your brain just doesn't work that way. And so you
Yeah.
have to trust in the science because we have special brains that let us understand it. And it's hard to not feel vindictive and angry about
Oppressed.
it. Oppressed. But there's a ton of literature that shows that nonviolent resistance is the most effective way of getting things to change, because it allows you to be the morally superior character in the story that people tell about the conflict. And you,
Yeah.
in the process of getting beaten on by the archaeological community from their halls of power, there may be enough people within that look around and are like, hey, I don't think that's right. I don't think it's right to beat on those ideas.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why I have Dr. Ed Barnard on my show, who's a classically trained archaeologist who actually has excavated Palenque and been with Hansen on El Mirador, who is really questioning not only what they're doing, but the history behind the Maya people. And he looks at my research and he's like, his jaw is dropping because he's like, dude, where'd you get this? Well, I spoke to the natives. And when I remind him that his colleagues haven't really bothered to speak with native people, he's somewhat shocked, but understands. It's almost, I don't want to say racist, but it's like, well, you don't speak my language. You're not white skinned. So I don't think you have value. I think
Or you
that's,
don't have an intellectual approach or like something
Yeah.
about that where it's just like you're not interested in the same precision that we're interested in or something like that.
How did
Yeah.
you manage to overcome that barrier? So what's your research process like?
so I was a program director for a conference called Whole Life 15, 20 years ago. And I decided to have a panel on Native Americans. I think Dances with Wolves had come out. We had Costner and some other people on the panel, but it was mostly the natives people came. Because Kevin Costner, hey, nice to see you, buddy. Bye. But the native people included a shaman, daykeeper. His name was Humbat's Men, Men, who eventually became my mentor. Spoke about ancient Earth. We had 1,000 people on their feet. clapping to these guys because they were amazing and they spoke on such a visceral level that people were like, that's the truth. That's the truth I need to understand. So anyhow, I after that, I was totally enthralled in this transmission of information. And there's one book that was written by a guy named Frank Waters who speaks on the Hopi. And that book was an actual narration of a history that is rarely talked about. But other than that book and a few others, there really isn't any written down history of the Maya or for Native people in the United States, for that matter. And I was invited to come down and see Chichen Itza, where he did his work, Humboldt Men. So I went down with a girlfriend in Cancun and not even thinking about Chichen Itza or whatever. And so he met us at Chichen Itza, and I was like, from that day on, and that was in 1995, I was forever changed. I was
What did he tell you?
Well, first of all, Chichen Itza, according to tradition, was a university. And if you go to the observatory, El Caracol, there are the heads of the different races who came to learn at Chichen Itza. And it's
Whoa.
funny because if you look at the face of these sculptures, there's Asian people, very much Caucasian, and then there's what only could be considered Paracas people with long heads. Very strange cranial on some of these people. Like, are these earthlings or whatever? But he talked about that, and then he began getting into subtle energy and why that's a big part of it. And I'm in the middle of transcribing a whole bunch of videotapes into audio and adding him to my book, The Mayan Controversy. But his description of the ancients felt so right. And the evidence, although it wasn't plentiful, was enough to really spark my interest to want to continue more research on that whole topic. So.
And so how do you find indigenous communities who can tell you these stories? Because I mean, I think that at least let's give it a charitable interpretation of it to the archaeologists, and let's say that at least some of their lack of interfacing with indigenous communities is the difficulty of finding native speakers. It's the difficulty of finding somebody who will help you talk to them. So
well, there's council.
There's
there's Maya councilmen everywhere. There's a big one in Guatemala. There's one in Mexico. There's one in Yucatan, and some of them are bilingual. Most of them are not. Some of them speak. I say bilingual. It's Spanish Maya. And of the 6 million Maya that are still around, I think the dialect is something like 60 different dialects of Maya. So that's a tough one right there. But you know what? If you have the desire to want to know, I would love to read a book from an archaeologist on classic Maya. And this is the other problem that I write about, is that there's a huge misnomer and confusion on who the classics were, the pre, the modern, the post, and who the pre-Maya were. And the thing is, we don't hear about this from the archaeological community. This pre-Maya, we haven't really figured out well, who were engineering geniuses who most likely developed the fruits, vegetables, medicines, and other support products for humankind. These guys are the ones that the classic followed. Now, what we don't know is, were there books that they used to follow? If the whole race is wiped out, how are they going to continue the knowledge? Well, there must have been libraries. There must have been something. There must have been a few people that collected just enough data for them to continue a couple thousand year generation of Maya people. So,
well, the conquistadors did a great job of erasing all of the libraries that were at least handed down by the Aztecs, from what I understand.
Friar Diego de Landa is the noted individual who took volumes of data, volumes of sculptures, volumes of information, and had a bonfire in Yucatan.
Man, yeah, he could have had a job at the CIA or something.
And the sad thing about it is the Mexican people just don't get it that this guy was committed genocide on multiple levels, and they still have statues of him. I mean, we go down and do tours, and the tour guide goes, "Hey, there's a hotel. We should check it out. It's cheap. It's called Diego de Landa." I'm like, absolutely not. I'm not gonna sanctify this guy. I am not going near this hotel.
But I mean, I
Burn the
think
thing
that's
down.
I mean, that speaks to the depth of erasure that he succeeded in committing, right? So he's the
Horrible.
symbol of a victory over a conquered people that has held for, hundreds of years.
Yeah, I was going to say, we haven't even really been interested as a Western society in reading these codices until very recently. I think the code
Yeah.
was cracked like, what, a generation, like barely a generation ago or something?
Yeah.
Was it Coe had a huge part in this, right?
Coe helped decipher the Dresden Codex, but there were a couple of people. There was a linguist who did some work in Germany and found out some fascinating things. Like the Dresden Codex has orbital data on Venus that really appears like there was an aircraft, a craft of some kind that got close enough to measure the gravity. It's so accurate, And they're saying, well, this is the other thing that the archaeologists will say. Their scientists were able to observe the planets by their naked eye and discern various shifts in gravity and things like that. I'm like, you can't do that with your naked eye. That's just BS. I can't think of his name. There's one guy, I think his name was Avente. The whole movement of astronomy and archaeology, the whole field is total guesswork.
I wonder if it was with the naked eye or if they didn't have lenses that haven't survived. I mean, I can't imagine a giant mirrored lens surviving for more than a couple years after the collapse of a civilization. I mean,
well, if you ever go to Chichen Itza, you go to the observatory. I had an engineer a construction engineer look at the deep pits in there. That outer body actually held some kind of apparatus that moved around the perimeter, and it was all deconstructed. And when you see the pictures of them reconstructing the building, it was taken down flat. So they guessed how it was, right? But they left these huge pits. And this engineer believed that there was some kind of mechanical system that brought this platform up that may have had optics in it of some kind.
I mean, I know that the Greeks were able to, just without optics, the ancient Greeks were able to discern the orbital motions and like the retrograde orbit of Mars and things like that just by watching them. Like the other night we could see Saturn pretty well, and you can see Mars from time to time, and you can watch these things go across. And if you had a conception of the solar system as it's essentially understood now, with the sun at the center and all blah blah blah, you might be able to discern some notion of gravity being this attractive force between the different bodies. But honestly, like looking at orbits and trying to make any statements about gravity beyond what Newton did, which is this very simple relationship, it's almost impossible. They try to calculate the effects of one planet on the other with respect to the sun and all this, and it's like, just forget about it. It's the calculations become just overwhelming.
And I think if you're a really good mathematician, you can do this. I was reading the other day, this astronomer's in my book. His name is he's discovered Pluto, Tombaugh. And Tombaugh, before he had his huge telescope, actually worked with other scientists and calculated unknown planets that eventually they found. And that's mind-blowing to be able to use calculations to find unknown planets, because they get a sense of them being somewhere and their influence on nearby planets, and then they can calculate where they're at, who they are, and things like that, which blows me away. I'm so bad at math. I'm going, and they're using trigonometry and and
But this is
very
also the
advanced.
stuff that ends up leading people to dark matter and dark energy, right?
Yeah.
Where they're just like,
Yeah.
well, we didn't see Pluto and we calculated it, so we just can't see most of what's in the universe, and so we can just add it to our calculations, and
But to come up with
everything
a bunch
works
of
out.
numbers and go, okay, it's trigonometry, and by the way, we found planets. I'm like, how in the God's name?
Yeah, yeah.
That is pretty rad. Yeah.
It's pretty cool. I think it's it's amazing.
What do
Uh,
you?
Go ahead.
But it's cool that they hypothesized it was a planet instead of just being like, "There's a mysterious cloud of dark energy that's floating around out there," but they were just like, "Yeah, I think it's a planet actually."
Yeah,
Like it's like that's totally reasonable, you know.
It's an object.
That's my kind of hypothesis. Yeah.
Yeah, what do you think is the most exciting stuff that hasn't been really looked at too closely yet? I assume that you follow the news of archaeological digs that are being uncovered, cities, because they're constantly pushing back the age of the oldest cities in the Levant. What do you think is...
I'm pretty radical. So I've been questioning history since I was a kid. And my grandfather was a country doctor that had just a superior library of Eastern philosophy, Hindu, Chinese. House was filled with Chinese, Hindu stuff. He was just very worldly, but not just so much worldly. He liked people, he liked cultures, and he impressed on me the importance of learning about other cultures. So, and so I'd read the Bible and go, "This is a what the hell?" I'd be asked to leave Sunday school every time. So my folks got tired of taking me to Sunday school. But I am of the firm belief that there was a civilization like ours, but much more advanced, that used natural occurring earthbound energies, electromagnetic energy, gravity, telluric fields, whatever, that were as sophisticated as us or more so, and I believe probably more so. And they left their marks in temples that you can see in Mexico and in places like China, and really you can see them in Egypt. And I'm starting to use handheld electromagnetic devices when I go to these places, because my mentor Humbats the Maya said that the places that are the highest in frequency are the most healing. And I talk about Hathor, and I talk about Isis, and I talk about some of these other pyramids. But what's fascinating to me is how the ancients understood how energy works without having these devices. But I believe there was an earlier civilization that did have devices that's not around anymore. And Michael said it perfectly. It's like, well, time would destroy these things. You wouldn't see them anywhere. But the proof is in the end result. The sculptural reliefs. Yeah, these amazing
stories.
temples.
You can't destroy stories. Is one of the most amazing things. I even look at something like the Bible and I'm like, well, these are stories that were probably around for hundreds of thousands of years, and this is just like the latest version of them.
Yeah.
What do you think is the most compelling evidence of the fact of the things that remain that speak to this super advanced culture that predates us?
The Great Pyramid, the Khufu Pyramid. You look on the outside, well, it's a lot of nice stones stacked, but when you go in, solid red granite, cut and placed on a level of precision that is machine-like. You can't put paper, anything between the stones. That is a machine, if there ever was a machine, And for for Egyptologists to say, well, it's a burial tomb, no. When I go to the museums in Mexico specifically, I have a whole archive of little figures holding technology, and these are like little machines. Or I have a couple of in my own collection of figurines wearing what looks like spacesuits, and it's so weird. In fact, I had an ex-astronaut of the Apollo mission. He didn't actually get to fly anywhere, but he was very central in actually developing the suits they wore. I sent him a series of photographs of this figurine, and he says this is totally out of Apollo. This suit mimics the suits the Apollo astronauts use. Well, I didn't preference anything. I just said, look at this. And he wrote a 5-page paper on how this not only mimics, but how it resists zero atmospheric conditions. Well, what's the Maya doing with a zero atmosphere suit? My belief is that they actually left the planet. Um, if you know anything about the Mahabharata wars that are featured in Hindu literature, it's supposed to be a myth, and yet there is evidence written in these verses that shows different places that are cities that were destroyed that are to this day.
These are like space wars?
It's the war for Earth.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. And apparently the Maya may have been a part of it, and this is where these suits are coming through. But we don't know. It's hard to say. It's so hard to pinpoint the accuracy or the validity of these myths without supporting data. So my whole thing is to find the data as much as possible, supporting my theories. And there you go. That's that's what I have to deal with is
and dreaming up mechanisms for how this could work too. Like, have you heard of these things called yak shells before? These they're found throughout like Iran and the Levant, and they're these pyramidal. They're actually kind of conical structures, but they can, in the middle of the desert, they can actually chill ice using them through these evaporative structures, basically. And they're thought to be hundreds of years old, some of them.
Oh, I've seen them. Like they're big round buildings, right? With the point.
With a point, yeah. And there's something about the way the air currents flow inside of them, where they can be used as coolers, and in some cases they can actually chill water to freezing. And I just had a patron, one of our patrons, shout out Ricky Cisco, hit me up the other day, and he was like, "Hey man, I think the pyramids were big like ice coolers." I was like, "Get out of here!" And he like sent me this thing about the yak chills, and I'm like, "Wow, like maybe." I mean, so it's like with each one of these structures, if we can conceive of physical mechanisms by which there was a power harvesting operation going on, even if it's turned into a pile of rubble, by being able to actually come up with demonstrable structures, right? Things where we could make little small models of it and show, okay, this is possible. And I would love to do more of that, especially with our program, is try to actually reproduce some of these things.
It's like when they were looking at Leonardo da Vinci's notes, and they actually created the 3D version of some of the machines that he was thinking about. That's kind of it's a great idea.
Yeah, I'd love to see more of that. Especially with some of these ideas, because I think the problem for a lot of people is they hear these far out ideas and they're so far out that they're unimaginable to most people.
I started getting into Tartaria a little while ago because I had a bunch of friends that were talking about, the ancient race of giants and Tartaria and the mud floods. And I found that there was a lot of pointing at old structures and suggesting that they were harmonic energy harvesters, but then you look into, okay, well, how did they work? What did it look like?
Right.
That's not an occupation of the people that are into Tartaria. Tartaria is more interested about just pointing out the fact that it is, not, well, how could it have worked?
Because the next stage of like it's possible is like, okay, let's check out some of the possibilities. I'm not saying we're gonna prove like one of them was
it's mechanism. Like once you have enough evidence that you're like it's possible, then you have to move on to mechanism
and try out a few different mechanisms, right? And just see like, okay, well, we have these various ways that you could, earth batteries are a thing, for instance, right? We can actually draw. You could go outside right now, especially if you live in like a iron heavy soil area, you could go out and make an earth battery, and you can power LEDs and do whatever you want with it. So it's like, can we scale that up? Are there places on Earth that correspond to these sites that we could scale that up? I mean, I would just love to see some of that work.
To go back to Tikal, the last city, if you look at the John Burke's work, they were saying that they were getting readings of, I think, 800 volt potential differences.
Yeah. Which he even mentioned sounds scary, but apparently it's a type of electricity that isn't deadly. So he's up there standing on top of the pyramid measuring this, getting these very high readings, but it's not killing him. But it's
low
high
current,
enough.
right? Yeah.
It's a different kind of current, yeah.
Because you can have those like Tesla coils, right, where you're like shooting lightning bolts out of your head and stuff, and you're totally fine. Because I think the currents are just so tiny. We were trying to make sense of this recently because we're trying to build a little something too for one of these.
But can you imagine 55,000 of those types of pyramids producing a telluric energy field? What are they doing with that?
It would be a power grid. I mean,
but is it? I tend to think it's more atmospheric, like it's doing something to the environment.
It might, but I guess what I mean by power grid is I'm like, you were saying that, and I mean, and Burke's work seems to show that if you put these seeds at the top of this pyramid, they germinate better, they grow better
Right.
than the seeds that are kept at ground level or the seeds that are kept in the hotel room, or even seeds that are placed on a different pyramid, right? So something is
Right.
happening to the plants. Shiloh this morning found a bunch of articles that talked about how electric current helps plants grow. So this is
I was about
evidence.
to hook up electric current to my plants after reading it.
Yeah.
Actually, I was like, "Oh, that's pretty cool." It's like
You might get a
repeatable.
monstrous bush. Watch out. You could have fist-sized flowers. All of a sudden you have a killer plant, and there you
Right? You
go.
could probably brand it
But if
too.
you
Yeah.
have
Electric
50
vegetables. And
Okay, and so now you go even further where you build 55,000 pyramids that you all link them together and grow directly underneath them. It's basically you have taken the thing that you would have to then because Burke talks about it where he says that even now Maya farmers will take their seeds and they'll carry them to the top of the pyramid. And I'm like, yo, that's really hard. If you're building a civilization, you can't expect all of your farmers to go from wherever their fields are and to go to their pyramid and to go to the top.
Yeah.
You're going to build 55,000 of these pyramids so that they basically put out enough of electromagnetic radiation that they have a zone of efficacy around them.
Well, the descendants of the first people are using the pyramids for seed propagation, but that's not what they were built for.
Hmm.
I gave a talk a couple of years ago. My thinking is that Tesla in his Wardenclyffe Tower followed a similar type of thinking, and he actually took that idea that the pyramid sitting on a telluric field could broadcast energy. His Wardenclyffe Tower was free energy.
yeah,
Complete.
some people have linked the Tunguska explosion to Tesla's tower.
So I mean, what it brought in a asteroid and
No,
blew
they're
up
saying. I mean, there's scant evidence of an asteroid from that, right? If you read about the Tunguska event, you'll find that it burned up in the atmosphere. There's no evidence of it or whatever. But
no,
we
it
do.
destroyed. That was
I mean, it
bad.
leveled several kilometers.
Yeah.
And so I read a really interesting hypothesis about it being linked to his experiments at I forget the name of his laboratory on the island there, which incidentally burnt to the ground, and he lost all his funding afterwards. So.
He lost his funding as soon as he showed that he could create free energy. And Edison freaked out, and all the guys that were supporting him are like, wait a minute, we want to charge for electricity, buddy. We don't want it to be free energy. But he was so far of himself. There's a whole series of promotions he was giving. He had illustrations where self-propelled planes, cars, submarines were all driven by this unseen energy.
Hmm.
And so when I see the Maya and you see evidence of perhaps spaceships, perhaps, I mean, this is so far out, self-propelled vehicles. Why would they build such monstrous roads? If you look at a Sakbi, they're white roads, many of them are designed to last hundreds, if not thousands of years. One of the things that they discovered when they did this monstrous scan and at Guatemala, and they found 60,000 of these unknown ruins, they also found the largest Sakbis in the world. Some of them were almost like a half a mile wide by several hundred miles long, perfectly cut, perfectly stable for water to run off. And yet we're told the Maya didn't have the will. So my hope is that they go over there, start excavating, and they open up a tunnel and there's some kind of a car or something.
Yeah.
That'd be amazing.
I think there's an element to this of we really, not we, but, folks in general really want to believe that we are at the absolute height of the pinnacle of human ability, right? It's a really reassuring thought that, things only get better, right? Like that there's a one-way direction to human civilization and it's better. It's always better, right? And if you start thinking about the fact that, well, maybe there was actually civilizations that were doing better than us, what does that say about the arrow of progress? And it's a very unnerving sensation, I think. And
that's one of the things that is the big question right now with the rebranding of UFOs and the UAPs is unidentified aerial
I noticed
phenomenon.
that.
The government is changing the narrative because they're questioning the propulsion systems for these unusual exotic craft, and they're trying to make it a scientific inquiry, which some people says may be the coming of first contact. Now, I've had Dr. Avi Loeb from Harvard on the show many
Yeah,
times.
he was on ours too.
And okay, great. So he's right now he's trying to do a dredge program
Yeah.
to see if he can get.
We're trying to tag along for that. Actually, he was like, well, maybe. So we'll see.
Just
That
like,
would
look,
be cool.
we don't eat a lot. Like,
Yeah,
we'll
just hide out in the stowage, on the ship. And
exactly, and we'll make
That
a good
would be
video.
so cool. You're right. I mean, even to help him, do the scanning of the ground and analyzing the data.
just document it, right?
Yeah.
We'll see. We'll see.
Yeah.
I guess there's a Netflix group that's interested too, so we'll probably lose to them. But
Exactly.
he did tell us to hit him up come October, so we'll see.
I mean, I think that so how are you connecting this to Avi Loeb, though? His dredging of the
my
ocean.
point was that Avi Loeb is open enough to understand that there are civilizations out there. When he says there's probes, here's a Harvard professor saying, you know what? And he told me on my show, and he might have said this to you guys, he will not sign a non-disclosure agreement with the U.S. Space Command, because as soon as he signs a non-disclosure, he cannot divulge anything he finds. He believes that the Oumuamua asteroid was an actual probe, an alien probe. We didn't catch it in time. The data that he did get shows that it changes its trajectory, it changes its velocity, and these are things that you can't do unless there's some form of intelligence behind the craft. So I'm trying to remember where I'm going all over the place on
Well,
this
we were
one.
talking about the way that the government is rebranding UFOs to UAPs,
Yeah,
and now they're trying to make it kind of a scientific study.
So I think that they've known about other civilizations for decades. And I think that, and how do we apply this? If there's a civilization that's 1,000, 10,000, a million years in advance of us, if we were to know about them, we automatically evolve. How? How do we evolve? Because we're not the only ones in our universe. Because we're not as sophisticated or as bright as we think we are. How do these craft move? I have a regular NASA engineer and astronomer on my show who has had his own sightings and has begun to measure how these propulsion systems work on these craft. And when he began publishing his work, NASA sent out what he calls the Men in Black.
The goons.
And apparently they have harassed him and his family and his mother. It's been really, really sad because this is a really good person, a good scientist, and his data is excellent. And he's legit. He's not just saying, "Oh, this is cartoon land." I'm not, he's actually seen these craft where he lives, and it's almost like they are slowing down enough so he can actually take photographs of them, which is really strange because for years, whenever you saw a photo of a UFO, it was either blurred, not really a great focus or clarity. And a lot of his photographs, it's like he's thinking, hey, slow down, take your force field down or whatever, because his photographs are really good. You can see emblems and all kinds of stuff.
What was his,
I'd love to talk to him.
His name is Marion Rudnick.
Mary.
I'll send me an email. I'll send it to you.
Cool.
He's in your area.
Very good.
Yeah, it's hard to
Excellent.
find folks that are really studying UFOs to come on the show who have done a ton of work. There's you go on the internet seeing who's doing this, and it's 4 or 5 people, and they're all mysteriously inaccessible, and it's very interesting.
Are you willing to comment on Lou Elizondo?
I don't know him well enough, but he is a little too far out there. There's a big conference down where you guys are. It's called. It happens every year. It used to happen every year out in the desert. It's called Contact in the Desert, and every single major person who's published on UFOs or the alien phenomenon goes and speaks there. And Alonzo, he has some credibility, but it's easy to go Hollywood. And when someone waves money in your face, your story can get distorted all of a sudden. It can be from I saw it to I was in the craft itself.
Yeah, well, memories are like that, right? We rewire. The more that you revisit a memory, the more that you've rewired it. So even if you assume the absolute best case scenario of truly attempting to be honest, the more that you retell the story, the more that you'll embellish it here and there. Before you know it, you're convinced that it's the case.
Especially if that's what people are reacting to, and like your audience, you get like 10,000 likes for like this post about your slightly embellished story. It's like, well,
I've been really perplexed about the UAP stuff because it seems like exactly like you said, the government is really pushing on it. Lou Elizondo is, CIA government guy who's coming out and he's saying that he was working on this for the federal government. There's all this things being told to the public, but it feels almost like a distraction. It just doesn't feel like there's a ton of evidence. There's the Tic Tac UFOs, but somebody the other day sent us a link to.
it's my dad actually.
That's right. It was your dad. Shiloh's dad sent us a link to a story
It was a Wall Street Journal story
that the government was. Do you want to?
I'm sorry, yeah, I can even already. It's just that the government had been working on projects where they had these heat holograms that they were able to project, and they were able to project them from satellites, and it was an idea for aerial combat that they were hoping to use. If they were ever to fight a superpower who had stealth technology and all this stuff, maybe they could have them distracted with these fleets of fake airplanes, basically. And so my dad was like, I wonder if that's what the Tic Tacs are. Essentially, he's a hardcore skeptic, but he's also kind of curious about the UFOs too. So
the Tic Tacs that the Navy was imaging, that solidified and actually exposed any kind of cover up that the U.S. Space Command was trying to conduct. And basically, we can thank Congress for saying, what's going on here? What are you guys doing? And they had to come out and basically say, okay, this is what we've researched. I think they're spending billions on black ops on study. There's a really good book.
There's like $20 trillion missing from the military budget, or is it $2 trillion or?
No, it was in the tens. I don't remember. I haven't studied in a couple of years, but there's like huge leaks of cash, like unimaginable leaks of cash.
Yeah, it's black ops. You guys got to get a book by Colonel Phil Corso. It's called The Day After Roswell.
Yeah.
And this is a guy who worked in the Pentagon, and this is in the 40s when these down UFOs were found. In his story, and a lot of people say he's full of it, but the guy doesn't have any reason to lie. He believes that they extracted all kinds of technology from these down craft, reversed engineered them, and this is where we get lasers, we get various types of technology. The microchip apparently all came out of down UFOs, and this is where we've evolved. I'm not saying the internet came from down UFO, but some of the very exotic technology has come from reversed engineered.
Well, you could trace the internet back to, circuits that were developed for spaceflight. I mean, admittedly by NASA during the Apollo years and so forth. And if you trace the NASA program back, you end up at the rockets that are being shot at England during World War II.
You end at the Nazis.
Yeah, you end at the Nazis eventually. It's just interesting to trace these things all the way back. So
yeah,
who knows what sort of injections of knowledge have occurred.
Phil Corso is his book is a real quick, easy read, but what he has to say and the cover up behind all this is just astounding. It's like there's a report that NASA did in 1960. It's the Brookings Institute report where they asked what would happen if there was a first contact between an off-world race and the people of the United States. And this think tank and Brookings in Washington basically said people would be agitated and unhappy. Religions would have a real hard time. There may be suicides. It would be a horrible disruption, blah, blah, blah. And I thought to myself, okay, that's 1960. Well, is this rebranding of UAP from UFO correspond to an update on that? Have they looked at it through another think tank that they haven't published the data from and discovered that, okay, people are going to be more accepting of a UFO. They're going to be more accepting of the beings in the UFO. Although scary, I think if you look at it from a social media point of view, people are like, bring it down, baby. Come on. What are you waiting for? What? They're flying around our planet. We want to know what's going on. So,
I
I
think the
mean,
level of social unrest that would unfold in the aftermath of such a disclosure. So if you combine the legalization of drugs like psychedelics and THC all around the country, the government admitting to there being aliens, and social media, if you think the 1960s was a crazy time, those three things together would blow the lid off this thing in
oh,
a
yeah.
way that would just destabilize society to a crazy degree.
That's
And
funny you mentioned that. That's hilarious because people like Terrence McKenna regularly wrote about taking ayahuasca and some of these other drugs or psychedelics and communicating with what he thought were UFO alien occupants. So who knows? Maybe that's a way to touch base with them.
because I mean, I mentioned this on a different podcast when we talked to the psychedelics guy, and I was like, I think that there's fewer cults than there were in the '60s, and he was very skeptical about that. But I do think that having access to these hallucinogenic substances, where you're able to transcend reality and see something else, gives you a more fertile ground for way far out ideas. Like I'm reading.
Yeah,
Have you read Tom O'Neill's book about the Manson murders? It's called Chaos.
no.
Tom O'Neill was a journalist who was hired by a magazine called Us magazine when it was like a monthly thing before it became a tabloid to write a 30th anniversary piece on the Manson murders.
Oh, wow.
And he had to come up with a new angle, and so he started exploring it. And the new angle he basically ended up with, which he never ended up publishing the piece in the magazine. The magazine has since
He
closed
kept
down.
writing the piece for 20 years, essentially.
Yeah, he's been writing the piece for 20 years, so he finally put it out as a book. And the end result is he's suggesting that Manson was a CIA/FBI asset that had been trained in the use of psychedelics and violence, and was maybe an experiment done by this free clinic in the Haight-Ashbury district where there was a CIA doctor who was working there and doing research on the relationship between psychedelic substances and violence. He was
Wow.
like kept out of jail multiple times despite the fact that he was a convicted felon who was violating parole. There's all these stories of how he was protected by the state from ever going back into jail, allowed to go to his
A
ranch.
lot of Jeffrey Epstein parallels here.
Yeah, a lot of like really weird stuff, but it really strikes me at the power of it really strikes me how powerful psychedelics are to rewire people's minds.
And if you ever wanted to undermine psychedelics and revoke their credibility, what better way than the Manson murders? I mean, that basically ended the hippie movement overnight. It was pretty much that capped it off, right?
It was
So,
horrific. It was
if
horrific.
you wanted to discredit the use of psychedelics, what a better way to do it.
That's definitely
Yeah.
true, but I'm also just thinking about the powerful social unrest that comes from that and how beneficial it is to keep people from being able to bind together under a single banner where it's about progress, it's about fighting racism and inequality and the fact that everybody has all this money and they're keeping it all to themselves while everybody else just scrambles for, pieces of trash that fall off their table.
Yeah, psychedelics are a wonder drug for a lot of people. I call them plant medicines, but it's funny that you're talking about the negativity possibilities of psychedelics. There's some growing voices in the political area that are speaking up against cannabis as a real big problem, as leading to psychosis and leading to other stronger, dangerous drugs. We're talking about the South. I'm sorry, it's the American South, which I'm sorry, I have a problem with.
I mean,
But
I think that so check it out. I think that it is people don't like to talk about it because it's used as ammunition for those who would want to criminalize it and continue to treat it as a dangerous substance.
right,
And I think that does us a disservice because in an honest conversation about the substances and their effects, we have to talk about the fact that some people don't come back.
Yeah, I've had a long time ago, I had a friend who just regular weed would just completely ruined him. It just ruined his mind. I mean, the doses he was taking were astronomical, and so forth. But
And it's not
So
to the fact
he was damaged emotionally after so many
yeah,
abuses.
just insane paranoia. And, clinically they speak of people who have tendencies towards that being at risk for it. But I think that some people are just committed to such intense doses of these so consistently that it really begins to remodel the architecture of their mind.
Yeah.
And, there's a very different thing uh, experimenting with psychedelics, even treating it as with some intention of exploration versus like, I'm going to live like this 100% of the time. Like from dawn till dusk, every day, I'm going to push the limits of how much of this substance I can take. It's like, that probably won't work out for you in the end.
That's an addictive personality, I think, too.
Yeah, definitely.
It's funny that you mentioned that. When I was in high school, and LSD was the thing to do. I had friends that really overdid it, and I think it did damage their cognitive abilities on certain levels. Like it was a long time ago, I can't remember, but a couple of friends really were so changed. They were damaged in some respect, and I don't know if it's because of the dosage, what the combinations of drugs were. But those guys experimented for us today, so
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
I mean, I think that the future of all of this is really interesting. There's always there's the suggestion of may you live in interesting times.
yeah,
And it seemed for a lot of my life that we lived in very boring times. But I think that we actually do live in quite interesting times. And there's this intersection of people taking advantage of their own or taking control of their own awareness and their own bodies and the substances that they use that's overlapping with the new science that's coming into the world, that's overlapping with this stuff that's changing in the government about are there aliens, are there not aliens.
exactly, yeah.
And your work sits squarely at the intersection of all of that. And so it's been a fascinating conversation.
Well, thank you. I enjoy speaking with you.
And
It's always
we do
fun.
I do as I
And
mean
folks,
we do as well.
if you're not already following Cliff's podcast, where can people find you?
Any podcast network, if you're on iTunes, any of the thousands of networks out there, or you can go to earthancients.com and you look for the banner. We have now 600 specific shows on that website you can check out.
Very nice. And you also do tours, right? So you actually take people to these places with Egyptologists and Mayaologists.
Yeah, we go to Mexico once a year, and our guide is Dr. Edwin Barnard, who was pivotal in excavating and surveying Palenque and a couple of other smaller sites in Guatemala. He's great fun. He's great knowledge. And one of the great things about having a Mayanist with you is that he has access to some of the temples that are not available to the general public. So we get to climb some pretty cool buildings. So
That's amazing.
yeah,
That sounds amazing. Yeah, I hope that I am wealthy enough to partake in something like this one
Yeah,
day.
exactly.
we make it really reasonable. I mean, you guys honestly should come. If you don't do it with me, do it with somebody else. Go to Egypt to see these temples, because when you see them, there's a memory that comes up. It's like
Man,
a
I would
database.
love to. Yeah.
And you're like, I've been here before. Or it's like,
Mm.
this place is very cool, but it's so mysterious. What's going on here?
That's amazing.
I
So
really hope we can someday. Yeah.
Yeah, and I hope that we get so when your book comes out, The Maya Controversy, hopefully we can have you back again and talk about all the stuff that you lay out there.
I hope you have me come on for the Black Knight Satellite. That's the next book next spring.
Oh,
Next
cool.
spring? Okay. Yeah, we'll do that.
Yeah.
see
Okay,
you
cool.
then.
Great.
All right,
Awesome.
Cliff. Have a great
Thanks.
rest of your day, man.
Yeah,
Thanks for
thanks so
coming.
much.
Thanks a lot.
See you, man.